Morning from James chapter 1, verses 1 through 4 as the text for the message. This will be for our text for today and next Sunday also. This started out to be one sermon, but the more I prepared, the bigger and longer it got, and by Friday I made the decision to split it up into two sermons because it was just long. You wouldn't think there's so much in 4 verses, but let me tell you, there's a lot. So this Sunday and next, we're going to be looking at today, Tested Faith is the title of the message. And the next Sunday, we're going to look at the same passage, but from a slightly different angle. Why God allows us to be tested. What is God trying to accomplish when He allows us to go through tests? So let's read this morning, James chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. If you've ever been through difficult times, if you've ever had problems in your life, if you've gone through challenges, this sermon is for you. James writes this: James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations. Greetings. Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. And today we're just going to look at verses 1 and 2. The book of James was written probably by James, the half-brother of Jesus. There are a number of men in the New Testament who go by the name of James. We're not told which one of them it was, but tradition says it was James, the half-brother of Jesus. He was a great leader in the early church. You may remember from, as we've studied the Gospels together in past years, that none of the family of Jesus except his mother believed in Jesus during his lifetime, and James's half-brother would have come to faith after the resurrection. He was the pastor of the great church at Jerusalem, which was the mother church of all the New Testament churches. They sent Paul and others on those great missionary journeys when the other churches were founded. And it's by far, I think, the most practical book in the New Testament. It's just filled with practical wisdom on how to live. We often think today of the church in the New Testament era as being at its zenith. You know, that's when the church was at its apex. That's when the church was the ideal church. We even talk today about the New Testament church. A lot of books are written every year in the religious field on how to recapture the New Testament church. And we forget often that the entire New Testament was written against the backdrop of persecution. James, which was probably the first book in the New Testament to be written, was written at a time of great persecution in the church. They lived in the Roman Empire under an emperor named Claudius. Christians were being slaughtered at that time, put to death. A lot of the bad things that happened in the Roman Empire were blamed on the Christians. They were sort of an easy target to place blame on. Later on, when Rome burned, you might remember that Nero blamed the fire on the Christians. Their names were slandered. If you were alive at that time and you were a Christian, your name was mud in most of the Roman Empire. So their reputations were ruined. There came a time when in the city of Rome, now remember, most of these early Christians were Jews. And because the early Christians were preaching Christ so forcefully and so persistently in the city of Rome, Claudius actually expelled every single Jew out of the city. They all had to go, just because some of the Jewish Christians were preaching Christ. That's recorded in the book of Acts, by the way. Acts chapter 18, verse 2 mentions that. But also 2 Roman historians from the era also write about that. And they say that the Christians that the Jews were kicked out because the Jewish Christians were preaching Christ. So they lived at a time of great persecution. And Jewish Christians at that time were scattered around the world. That's when he mentions the 12 tribes being scattered, or your translation might say the dispersion. That's what he's talking about, how the Jewish Christians were just scattered all over the world because of persecution. And so James writes to them and to us to tell us today what we're going to look at about the tests of our faith. And then next Sunday, why God allows it, what his purpose is. So let's dive right into the text, okay? And let's look at what he says. Look at verse 2. I'm going to tell you 3 things really quickly that he says about tests here that I want you to remember. Number 1, he says that tests, this is in verse 2, that tests are a certainty in life. Look at what he says. Count it a joy when you meet trials of various kinds. He doesn't say when the tests come. Or rather, if they come, but rather he says when they come. There is an increasingly popular notion in Christianity today, especially I see it, some of the television evangelists who preach this, that if you just have enough faith, or if you have the right mindset, the right positive outlook on life, that you can live a life as a Christian above trouble. That you can be free from the trials of life. And this is utter nonsense, at least so far as New Testament doctrine is concerned. Trials come to every single one of us. That's what he says. Count it a joy when the trials come. No Christian is exempt from trouble in this life. So that's the first thing he says. And then the second thing he says about trials is that they come at indefinite times. When he says, count it a joy when they come, he writes it in a way that implies that their arrival is uncertain. In other words, you don't know when the trials are coming. If you did, you'd be prepared for them. If you knew that Wednesday you had a big spiritual test coming, you'd spend all day Tuesday praying, right? All day Tuesday studying the scripture, all day praying, getting ready for that big trial that was coming on Wednesday. But the thing is, we don't know when they're coming. When I was in seminary, one of my professors, at the beginning of each semester, there'd be a list of books that would be handed out. You had to read all of those books during the semester. And then there'd be a list that would tell you the date of each of the tests for that semester. There'd be, of course, a test at about the midway point. And then there'd be a test at the end of the semester, and then there might be 1 or 2 tests along the way. But now, this professor was unique, at least among my professors, in that he was the only one who never, once he handed out that list, he never announced when the tests were coming. He expected you to take that list, read it, and know, for example, if it said there's a test on October 20th, you better be ready for a test on October 20th, because he was not going to remind you or tell you about it. Tomorrow's the test. He just expected you to know. Well, this professor, as all of the professors did, they always began their classes with prayer. Once the students got in and we were about to study whatever the subject was, they'd always begin the class with prayer. And the professors would pray for the students and whatnot. And so this professor did that as well. And one particular day, we're all in there gathered, and it was a test day. And so it was on the list, And so as the professor led in the prayer at the beginning of the class, he said, "And Lord, I ask you to bless the students today as they take this test." And from the back of the class, one student shouted out, "Oh Lord, I forgot to look at the list." That's what life is like, isn't it? It's that phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning. It's the sudden screech of brakes. It's the unexpected news from the doctor when you get your test results. You're not prepared for the test because you don't know when they're coming. They come at uncertain times. And then the third thing he says, is also in verse 2, is that trials or tests are of various kinds. The tests are certain, they come at uncertain times, and there are various types. Look what he says in verse 2, when you meet tests or trials of various kinds. The trials are varied in nature. I looked that word up, by the way. I was curious about it. The Greek language that James wrote in, it's such a picturesque, colorful language. I was surprised to see what the literal translation of this word. It means multicolored. Sort of like, made me think of Joseph's coat. You remember? He wore that coat of many colors. We might say today multifaceted. What he's saying is, the tests that come to you, they're not all alike. Some tests may be physical. Some are financial. Some are spiritual. Some are emotional. Some are psychological. The tests are of all different sorts. And the tests are not the same for every person. The test that you get is not the same as the test the person sitting next to you in the pew is going to get. You ever notice that? Sometimes we just feel like the tests I've gotten are just harder than anybody else's test. But your thumbprint is on the test that God gave to you. Somebody said that with every test God gives us, he's trying to put something inside of us that's not there yet. And I think there's truth in that. That's why the tests are individual in nature. We tend to be critical of people who fail tests that we wouldn't fail. Not realizing that what may be easy for you may be a fiery trial for someone else. But for that person, the test that you fail, for them that might be a piece of cake, a walk in the park, something easy to deal with. So don't be judgmental on others when they fail the test God gives them. With every test we have, God is trying to place something inside of us that's not there yet. Every test is unique to that person. For example, in the Old Testament, only Abraham was asked to sacrifice his son. Moses wasn't asked that, neither was Jacob, neither was Joseph. In the New Testament, only the rich young ruler was asked to sell everything he had. Jesus didn't ask Nicodemus to do that. Your test is designed specifically for you. We've just finished our year-long study of the Gospel according to John in our morning Bible study. You remember what we read in the last chapter there in chapter 21? That this is after the resurrection. Jesus is about to ascend into heaven, and he pulls Peter aside and he says, "Peter, do you love me?" And Peter says, "Lord, you know I do." And then he says, "Well, then feed my sheep." You'd think Peter might be happy, might feel privileged that the Lord has given him this assignment. But instead he looks over there and he sees John, and he notices Jesus didn't give John anything to do. And so the first words out of his mouth were, "Well, what about him? What does he have to do?" And you remember what Jesus told him? In so many words, he said, "That's none of your business. I'll give him to do what I choose for him to do. You do what I told you to do." The tests are designed just for us. So they're certain, they're coming, he says, but you don't know when. And they're going to be in all different sorts of areas. But they're designed just for you. But now look, and this is the last one. Look at what he says also in verse 2. Count it all joy when you meet tests of various kinds. Now, let's be honest. Most people don't greet tests with joy. They meet them with, resentment. They wonder, why me? That's the first question some people ask, why me? Or resignation, they just want to quit. I had someone call me up this week, a person I've known for many, many years from another church. She called to tell me that her husband, faithful Christian for many, many years, because of some tests that they went through, she said he's an atheist now. He tells me he's given up on God. Won't go to church, won't even allow the Bible to be read in the house. James tells us that when the tests of life come upon us, we are to face them with joy. Now, what on earth does he mean by that? Is he saying that the tests themselves are joyous? No, they're not. You know that. The tests aren't joyous. We don't giggle our way to the hospital. We don't frolic to a funeral. You don't sit there with a smile on your face as your bank account keeps going lower and lower. James is telling us that we can face the tests of life with an undiluted sense of well-being. That's what that word joy means there. He's not saying the tests are fun. He's not saying the tests aren't real. I read a few years back, remember that year, I want to say it was maybe around 2012, 2013, somewhere in there, maybe 14, when there were all those tornadoes down south. In Alabama one year, there were a number of just horrible tornadoes. And this man, a Christian man, I read about this in one of the pastor's magazines I get. This man had a son who was petrified, just a boy, but he was petrified of tornadoes. And the dad didn't know how he was going to, convince this boy that there was nothing to worry about. And so one day when their area of the city was under a tornado watch, he took his son to the front door and he opened the door and they looked out over the neighborhood there. And this was a well-to-do family. They lived in an upscale neighborhood. All the houses were, big, strong, sturdy houses. And he told his son, he said, "Son, look at those houses." And he's speaking from the safety and security of his big, strong, safe house. And he said, "We live in a safe neighborhood. And look, all of these houses are safe and secure, just like ours." And he said that just at that time, a tornado touched down and destroyed some of those big, safe houses there in the neighborhood. The storms of life in the real, physical, natural world, they're real, aren't they? And the storms of life in the psychological world, the spiritual world, the emotional world, they're real as well. You go back and look at the ministry of Jesus. When he encountered people who were sick, he never said to them, "You're not really sick. The sickness is just in your mind." Instead, he said, "Peace, be well," and they were healed. When he was out on the Sea of Galilee and the storm came up and the disciples were afraid, he didn't say to them, "There's no storm. This storm is just in your mind." Instead, he said to the storm, "Peace, be still," and it was. When he came to Bethany, when his friend Lazarus had died, and Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, were bereaved because their brother was dead, Jesus didn't say Lazarus isn't really dead. The Bible says that he wept. The storms of life are real. So James isn't talking about pretending here. He's not talking about burying your head in the sand and ignoring the troubles of life as if they weren't real. He's saying that when the storms of life come upon you, you as a believer in Jesus Christ can face them with an inner sense of well-being that is what he calls pure joy or all joy, and it means literally undiluted joy. Inner well-being that cannot be shaken. That's the idea there. It's how Paul and Silas were able to sing in the Philippian jail, because nothing could change that joy that they had. Another thing, look at what he says in verse 2 also. He says, "I want you to," and depending upon what your translation is, he says either "I want you to count it pure joy," or "consider it pure joy," or "to reckon it pure joy." It's almost as if he's saying this is a decision that you will make. And it's a decision you make before the trials ever come. It's a mindset. It's a mentality. It's an act of will. Consider it or reckon it pure joy. Now, I say that you have to decide this before the tests come, because you remember what James has said about the nature of tests, that they come at unexpected times. We don't know when they're going to arrive. It's, I believe, the King James translation that says, "Consider it joy when you fall in to trials of various kinds. That word that's translated there as fall into, it's the same word that's used in Luke chapter 10, and when Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. You remember, he says that traveler fell among thieves. He wasn't expecting it. They were robbers. He didn't know they were there. He wasn't anticipating it. It just happened. He fell there among them. And James says that trials of life are like that. They come upon us unexpectedly. But he's saying here that even with that, we can face them with joy. That inner sense of well-being, because there is nothing that can rob us of that. I was reading this week about a man named Frederick Booth Tucker. He was a remarkable man, born in the middle of the 1800s. I think it was 1853. An Englishman born into a wealthy, prominent family. One of those guys who from the moment he was born, his life was set. He was never going to have to worry about work. He was never going to have to worry about money. A family that had enough money for 10 generations. But this man was saved at a D.L. Moody crusade when he was 22 years old. And some people, man, when they get saved, it really takes, and it literally transforms everything about them. And this man who was born to wealth and prominence and privilege and prestige, he renounced all of that. It became a missionary and later an evangelist with the Salvation Army, who tend to work among the lowest economic classes. This man went to Europe, to India rather. And not only did he work among the Indians there, but he worked among the very lowest caste. I don't know if you're familiar with the caste system of India or not, but the very lowest caste or classes, they're considered to be so, they call them untouchables. You can't even take something from their hand. The upper classes won't. That's the group that this man worked among. He also did some traveling, did some preaching in various parts of the world. And in 1903, he was in Chicago preaching at the great Salvation Army chapel there that they call the Citadel. Because they were here in the States, his wife had gone to visit family in the United States as he started this revival there in Chicago. And one night he was preaching on the consolation of Christ, how Christ can comfort us in every situation of life, every storm of life. And after the sermon was over, after the service was over, a man who was there in the sanctuary approached him. And the man said to him, "You wouldn't be preaching that message if you had just lost your wife like I lost mine. And if you had a house full of babies at home, children who were crying for their mother, you wouldn't be able to preach that sermon." Later on in that week, as his wife Emma was traveling by train to Chicago, the train derailed, and she was killed along with a number of other people. They brought her body on to Chicago and had the funeral service there. And Frederick Booth Tucker, at the conclusion of her funeral service, stood up as he stood next to her casket, and he said to the crowd that had assembled there, "Last week, as I was preaching in this very place, I preached on the comfort and consolation of Christ. And a man came up to me and said, 'You wouldn't be able to preach this message if you had just lost your wife like I lost mine, and if you had children at home who were crying for their mother like mine are.' And he said, 'I don't know if that man is here tonight, but I want to say to him that in the moment of my darkest despair, the comfort and the consolation of Christ is real. That Christ has comforted me in my despair.'" That's what James is talking about here. He's not saying that the trials of life are fun. He's not saying that they aren't real. They're real and they're terrible. But he's saying that when you are a child of God with faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, that there is no trial that can rob you of your joy, that inner sense of well-being, that there is nothing that you and God can't handle together. Now, next Sunday, we're going to look at what God's purpose is in these trials. Why does he either send them or allow them? And what purpose does he have in them?